David Crockett, Scout, by Charles Fletcher Allen. Earthquakes. Making shooks for New Orleans. The building of the flat boats. Davy goes to Reelfoot Lake. A feeling of awe comes over Davy. The story of a strange and mysterious place, something about the night riders and their neighbors, where some of Davy's descendants now reside. The Padre's story of the Reelfoot earthquake and the destruction of New Madrid. The earth trembles beneath his listeners' feet. After the harvest was over in the fall of 1825, the year after Davy's term as representative had expired, he saw a prospect of making money by the shipment of staves to New Orleans. There was an unlimited supply of white oak on the Albion River, and on the shores of a lake about 25 miles from his home in the woods. He took a couple of horses and an outfit and started for the lake, which he reached the next day. It is not known just what Davy meant by the lake referred to, but it was probably one of the widened parts of the slow and tortuous river, not far above Island No. 2, at the junction of the Albion with the Mississippi. As soon as he arrived on the ground, Davy hired men to build 2 flat boats and get out the staves. The staves were split from the straight-grained oak logs cut in the woods and hauled to the water. They were often called shooks, and when ready for market were made up in bundles for shipment. When used, they had to be hewed and trimmed with draw knives, then stood on end in a circle, when they were hooped with hickory bands into hogsheads and fitted with heads. The hogsheads were used for molasses and for the cane sugar produced in the South. Davy worked with the men he had hired, overseeing the plans for the boats until everything was well under way, when he had a visit from a neighbor on Reelfoot Lake, who wanted him to take a trip to his part of the country, less than 30 miles distant. Having heard something about this strange body of water, Davy agreed to go, and was in sight of his neighbor's clearing before sunset of the day following. As he saw the lake for the first time, a feeling of awe came over him, as if he looked into a vista of some old dead or dying world. A fair expanse of shining water, with islands bright with the autumn glories of deciduous trees, and skirted by hills that were dark with pine and hemlock, or thickly set with oak and maple groves, was dotted with black and decaying stumps that rose above the surface, high in air, like the masts of a sunken fleet. In places only the tops of the sunken trees were seen, but everywhere, like the wreck that covers the sea after storm and battle have done their work, were floating logs and drifting limbs, charred and unsightly relics of the wilderness. Reelfoot Lake is 50 miles long and several miles in width, and where it stems in the sun were once great forests and primeval hunting grounds. In 1907, it was the scene of a murderous affair that brought the night riders of Tennessee into ghastly prominence. On a dark night they killed 2 men, and a third escaped by hiding under one of the many logs near the edge of the lake. He was wounded by the bullets of the murderers and thought to be drowned. So little is known of the lake that a description of some of its features should be interesting. In 1909, Richard A. Paddock, in an article in Sports A Field, wrote, "It is a strange, weird, mysterious place, filled with uncanny sights and sounds, haunted by the ghosts of former dusky inhabitants, whom it swallowed without warning and extinguished in a twinkling of an eye in the most diabolical manner, and whose tortured spirits even now cry out for relief and freedom from cruel bondage on every dark and stormy night. Strange and uncanny are its surroundings, and strange and mysterious are its inhabitants. Stealth and superstition lurk on its borders. Danger and sudden and premature death are so common as to be held in contemptuous disregard. Mysterious secrets are hidden in its almost impenetrable islands, secrets and mysteries that I hesitate to mention here, for I have had my warning, and know the danger of disregard. The lake is inhabited by a race of people who are a class unto themselves. There are no others like them. They take their living and surplus from the waters of Reelfoot Lake. They have nothing else, no other means of livelihood. It is their sustenance, their farm, their business, their all. These fishermen make no idle threats. They are stern, determined, ignorant, superstitious physical giants, who make and execute their own laws and recognize no others. They suffer from mosquitoes, malaria, and chills and fever, to such an extent that their livers are always out of order, and life has a bilious hue. They go hungry often enough to make them desperate. They do not take kindly to the visiting sportsman. They feel that he is a trespasser on their rights. He is making them and their children go hungry and naked. He ought to be made an example of, to the discouragement of other future unwelcome guests. The lake now has all and more than it can support in comfort. Its inhabitants are very poor, always on the ragged edge, always in a hand-to-hand scramble with starvation. They have no other way of gaining a living. They cannot do manual labor. They have never done it, nor have their fathers before them. It is fish, hunt, and trap, or starve with them, and they usually do all four. The people about Reelfoot Lake have among them some of Davy's descendants. His daughters and sons lived in that part of the state, and his relatives and neighbors from the mountains followed the trail he had made. It is not fair to say that his principles live in the code of the night riders, but human nature is always the same, and the hungry fishermen of Reelfoot are as jealous of their preserves as was the red man of his hunting grounds. One night, when Davy sat with his friend's family before the flare of the blazing logs in the wide fireplace, there was with them a Catholic father who for years had wandered from St. Louis to New Orleans and Pensacola and back again, even as Brebeuf and the beardless Garnier and Isaac Le Joc had dared the dangers of the wilderness, seen visions of heaven while their stomachs were empty, and ever blazing the cross upon stately trees in the dark recesses of the forests. Davy asked the padre to tell him the story of the earthquake to which the lake owed its origin. He filled his pipe with tobacco cut from one of Davy's twists, and then for a long time looked into the heart of the fire without speaking. "Hey, 14 años, senores," he finally began in the softest of Spanish, and then, realizing that Davy would not understand him, began again. It was 14 years ago, almost, it being the night of the 16th of December of the year 1811, that I went on shore at the little city of New Madrid, leaving at the landing the boat in which I had come from St. Louis with brother Anselmo. When we had found a place in which to rest, and had refreshed ourselves with food for the first time in nearly 2 days, we walked about the place, being cramped and stiffened from our long sitting in the boat. The houses were far apart, built of logs, and set in the midst of mud and filth. But in a greater building than all the others, we heard the music of the dance, the sound of many voices, and all the echoes of thoughtless enjoyment. They were the French from New Orleans and St. Louis, boatmen and traders upon the great river Mississippi, and the Spanish of the settlement, with the Americans from the Ohio and the northern lands. We knew that we should see many we had known among the people there, and with brother Anselmo I entered the room. It was a great hall with floors of sawed timber, very smooth for dancing, and not like the floors of hewn logs that we were in the houses of that time. There were many candles about the walls, and also torches of light wood that flared and hissed and threw black shadows of the dancers across the floor. When they saw us, there was silence, and no one moved until we had been seated in the part of the hall where we could watch the others. Never have I seen, senores, so gay and so thoughtless a gathering. There were beautiful women there, and the bravest of men, and they were young. I saw the soft light of love in the eyes of men who had dared the tomahawk of the Indian, as they had dared the soldiers of Napoleon and the dangers of the deep, and the smiles that answered them were sweeter than those of fortune or of fame. As the night wore on, we looked from the open door of the hall across the swirling waters of the Mississippi. The stars were dim with haze, and the air was still and soft and damp. It seemed hard to breathe it down deep in the lungs, and the boatmen looked for rain. It was 11 hours of the night when wild sounds were heard without, and all the frolic ceased. The reports of many guns and the war cries of Indians were soon recognized, and they grew louder and came nearer. The people were saying to each other, "The war party is returning from the Chickasaw lands." It was not long before there came into the room many white men, and as many as 20 Chickasaws, daubed with paint and covered with mud. They had been in pursuit of some of Little Warrior's braves, who had hidden in the swamps after the murder of the white families along their trail. The chief, Big Tree, held up for all to see the head of one of the Creeks, a sight, senores, that chilled my blood, for I knew it to be the head of White Corn, whose house was built on the Coosa River, and whose hospitality was always to be counted upon. As I looked upon the wild rejoicing over the death of the misguided brave, the old Spanish timepiece rang the midnight hour, so softly and so sweetly, so like the benediction of an angel choir, that in an instant all was still. Then the floor seemed to rise and sway beneath our feet. The building rocked like a ship at sea, and as the torches and the candles fell one by one to the floor, the cries of terror and despair were like the shrieking of the bottomless pit. Before all could reach the street, a dozen were trampled underfoot. We were sick and faint with the swaying of the ground. The crash of the falling roofs of the cabins was mingled with the roar of the water, swelling in great wrathful waves about the banks. We held our breath as the earth rose suddenly under a cabin across the way, higher and higher, until, with a leaping out of gas-like flame, we saw what seemed an open grave, deep and wide and long, into which the fated house fell out of sight. There was no longer a crying aloud. Dumb with despair, the hopeless people awaited the coming of the tardy sun. The earth still rocked and trembled and yawned, and huge waves swept at times among the cabins lowered down. It was like the day of judgment, and what we should see when day had come, no man could think. It is a long story, senores, longer than you have time to hear. When at last there was a light once more, we looked across wide lakes where forests of pine and oak had stood the night before. In many a place the tops of the tallest trees were scarcely seen above the waves. Where the bayous had been wide and deep, there was new, strange land, without tree or plant, fresh from the bowels of the earth. The lake upon whose shores we sit tonight had swallowed the hills and valleys of an ancient hunting ground. The blackened trunks that had stood these many years will remain 100 more to tell the story of the earthquake that lasted for weeks and months and changed the face of the region about us. It destroyed the town of New Madrid, now but half rebuilt in a safer spot, and it swept the wilderness with all of the destructive force of a hurricane. From this there came the story of Tecumseh's wrathful threat to stamp upon the ground and destroy the cabins of the Tucabacha town. The padre ceased, for suddenly the cabins seemed to swing like a drifting ship. They all started to their feet, the children ran to their mothers' arms, and then the swaying stopped. It was one of the strange quakes that have never entirely ceased in the 100 years since the time of the padre's story. As late as 1907, a rather disquieting shock took place in the region of Sandburg, but it did nothing notable in the way of damage. There is no doubt that the hurricane so often mentioned by Davy was the work of an earthquake. End of chapter 11, read by Spencer LeBlanc, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, May 2023.
Chapter 12, Hunting Bears. Hauling a net in Reelfoot Lake. A ton of shovel-nosed cats and alligator gars. Davy rubs his eye at the sight and resolves to keep out of the water. He kills 15 bears in 2 weeks. He goes home but soon feels obliged to have another hunt. With his son, he kills 3 bears the first day. The bear hunt in the cane. Takes a hungry man and family into partnership in the hunt. How the varmints spend the long winters. He trees a bear near Reelfoot Lake, mixing it up with the dogs, salting the meat. Early the next day, Davy and his host were at the shore of the lake, waiting for 3 boats that could be seen coming from a distance, 2 of them under sail. When they arrived at the Jepson landing, close to the house where Davy was staying, Davy's friend had his own boat ready, and in a few minutes all 4 were headed for a bay-like place between some of the islands. In one of the boats was a long cotton net, brought from St. Louis. Davy had never seen a net hauled, and was eager to watch the proceedings. When near the islands, the net was strung overboard, extending across the bay for several hundred feet. 2 boats were fastened to it at each end, and it was drawn in towards the land, where there were no stumps or trees to interfere. It was slow work, for the net touched bottom and often caught on sunken logs. There was no appearance of fish within it as it came slowly in, until both ends of the nets were fast to shore and the bite was being hauled. When it was about 30 feet out, a great fish broke water with a splash, and all over the surface within the ropes were ripples that told of others. Close to the shore were several stakes standing in the water, and attached to them was the pound net towards which the catch was being hauled. The 2 boats slowly narrowed the circle until most of the fish had gone into this. When all was ready and the large net was clear, the mouth of the pound net was closed, and it was freed from the stakes, where the 10 men of the fishing expedition pulled it to a small dock built of logs in a few feet of water. Standing on this, they lifted the pound net from the water and dumped the contents into the largest boat. Davy shouted with astonishment at the sight. As many as 40 shovel-nosed catfish and a dozen alligator garfish writhed and squirmed before his eyes. They might have weighed 1,000 pounds in all, but the traditionist of the Sandburg settlement had not been admitted to the Ananias Club, and gives only a vague history of the catch in which his grandfather was interested, under the arrangement of share and share alike. He knows that it was a big haul, but one that is, of course, often outdone today. In the account of a trip to the lake in 1908, to which reference has been already made, Mr. Paddock gives a description of the fish named, and it is so much more interesting than anything scientific that it is repeated here. When I went to Reelfoot, says Mr. Paddock, I had never heard of a spoonbill catfish, and when I saw on the boat more than 2 tons of these slippery monsters of the deep, with paddles on the ends of their noses more than 2 feet long, I had to pinch myself to see if I was awake. If I have laid myself open to criticism when I told about these 3 big black bass, I am now going to bust my reputation for veracity wide open, beyond all repair, for, by actual weight on the scales at our dock, 1/3 of those fish averaged 70 pounds apiece, and the smallest would weigh 15 pounds. If you have never been to Reelfoot and doubt this statement, take a trip down there, my brother. They are taking out these whoppers just the same today. They dress them and take them to the dock, where they get 1 cent a pound for them. They are the strangest of all fish. They have no scales or bones, except a grisly spinal column. They have a long, slender, symmetrical, and graceful body, and their upper jaws project away ahead, so at least 1/3 of their entire length is nose, which widens and flattens out into a graceful paddle. Most likely they use it as a shovel. I never had a chance to see one of them feeding. They live in deep water, but I imagine that they shovel around in the mud for worms. The garfish of Reelfoot Lake are of varying size, with long bills and sharp interlocking teeth. Some of them weigh 10 to 15 pounds and are formidable specimens. It is likely that after seeing what the water afforded, Davy preferred to take his chances with the bears. The fish taken in cold weather often are dried for winter use, and sometimes smoked, affording a valuable supply of food. The lake is frequently covered with wild ducks and geese, and water turkeys, or cormorants, act as scavengers. In Davy's time it was too expensive to kill waterfowl. His object in going to Reelfoot was to get meat for his friend, who was helping in the building of the boats. Davy had already killed and salted down enough for his own family, and as he seems to have loved bear hunting more than any other sport, he readily took the trip to the lake, where the first day or 2 was spent in fishing. The bears were very fat and very plenty, and, for that reason, easily treed. Davy said that he asked no favors of the bears except civility, as he had 8 large dogs as fierce as panthers, that no bear could get away from. The hunt near Reelfoot lasted 2 weeks, and in that time 15 bears were killed. Davy then went home, afterward putting in part of his time with the men who were splitting staves and building the boats. He seems to have been something of a capitalist at this time, or he may have been backed by someone's money. It was in December that he realized that he couldn't stand it without another hunt, and between Christmas and New Year's he and his son crossed the lake where the men were working for him, and turned the dogs loose. Before evening he had killed 3 bears, which they dressed and salted, putting the meat upon a scaffold built of saplings and brush. This was the only way to save it from the ravenous wolves. The meat being safe overhead, Davy and the boy were eating their breakfast when a number of hunters appeared with 14 dogs. The animals were in hard luck, for Davy tells us that they were so poor that whenever they indulged in barking, they had to lean against the first tree to rest. They fell on the bones left by the other dogs, and after the men had been given some of the meat from the scaffold, Davy left them and cut out. The hunting season was usually at an end before the new year, as the bears holed up when the weather became very cold and remained hidden until the sap started in the woods. Although they have no food or water, they are just as fat as ever in the spring, but as their cubs are born about the time the old ones appear, the mother bears are not hunted then for the sake of meat or fur. The year in which these adventures took place was warm during December, and as a story of Davy's hunting near the Obion had been read in 1,000 schoolrooms in the West, it will be given in as nearly his own words as possible. At this time he was everywhere known as Colonel Davy Crockett, and in the middle of the last century, when each scholar used to bring any book he could get to read from in school the history of Colonel Crockett, rivaled in the small boy's favor the life of General Francis Marion. The part most beloved of the young American was the following, which starts in at the time he left the hungry dogs to gnaw the bones of the bears he killed the day before. I hadn't gone far when my dogs took a first-rate start after a very large, fat, old he-bear, which runs right plump towards my camp. I pursued on, but the other hunters had heard the dogs coming and met them and killed the bear before I got up to them. I gave him to them and cut out for Big Clover Creek, which wasn't very far off. Just as I got there and was entering a high cane brake, my dogs all broke and went ahead, and in a little time they raised a fuss in the cane and seemed to be going every which way. I listened for a while and found my dogs was in 2 companies and that both was in a snorting fight. I sent my little son to one and I broke for the other. The son was nearly 18 years old. I got to mine first and found my dogs had a 2-year-old bear down a woolen away on him, so I just took my butcher and went up and slapped it on him and killed him without shooting. There was 5 of the dogs in my company. In a short time I heard my little son fire at his bear. When I went to him, he had killed it too. He had 2 dogs in his team. Just at this moment, we heard my other dog barking a short distance off, and all the rest at once broke to him. We pushed on too, and when we got there, we found that he had a still larger bear than either of them we had killed, treed by himself. We killed that one also, which made 3 we had killed in less than half an hour. He then goes on to say that the meat was taken care of as on the day before, and that afterwards he came to where a poor fellow, who was the very picture of hard times, was grubbing in the ground. I asked him what he was doing away in the woods by himself. He said that he was grubbing, clearing the ground, for a man who intended to settle there, and that he was doing it because he had no meat for his family and could earn a little. I was mighty sorry for the poor fellow, for it was not only a hard but a very slow way to get meat for a hungry family. So I told him if he would go with me, I would get him more meat than he could earn by grubbing in a month. I intended to supply him with meat and also to get him to assist my little boy in salting and packing up my bears. He had never seen a bear killed in his life. I told him I had 6 killed then, and that my dogs had just gone after another. He went off to his little cabin, which was a short distance in the brush, and his wife was very anxious he should go with me. So we started and went to the place where I had killed my 3 bears and made camp. Night now came on, but no word from my dogs yet. I afterwards found that they had treed the bear they had gone after about 5 miles off near a man's house, and had barked at it the whole enduring night. Poor fellows! Many a time they looked for me and wondered why I didn't come, for they knowed there was no mistake in me, and I knowed they were as good as ever fluttered in the breeze. As soon as it was light enough to see, the man took his gun and went to them and shot the bear and killed it. My dogs, however, wouldn't have anything to do with this stranger, so they left him and came back early in the morning to me. We got our breakfast and cut out again, and we killed 4 large and very fat bears that day. We hunted out the week, and in that time we killed 17, all of them first rate. When we closed our hunt, I gave the man over 1,000 weight of fine, fat bear meat, which pleased him mightily and made him feel rich. I saw him the next fall, and he told me he had plenty of meat to do him the whole year from his week's hunt. My son and me now went home. This was the week between Christmas and New Year that we made this hunt. When we got home, one of my neighbors was out of meat and wanted me to go back and let him go with me to take another hunt. I couldn't refuse, but told him I was afraid the bears had been taken to house by that time, for after they got very fat in the fall and early part of the winter, they go into their holes in large hollow trees or into hollow logs, or their cane house, or the hurricanes, and lie there till spring, like frozen snakes. And one thing about this will seem mighty strange to many people. From about the 1st of January till about the last of April, these varmints lie in their holes all together. And all that time they have no food to eat, and when they come out they are not an ounce lighter than when they went to house. I don't know the cause of this, and I still know it is a fact, and I leave it to others who have more learning than I have to account for it. The bears might be suspected of having learned and practiced the secrets of the Norwegian stove or the modern fireless cooker, whereby a little heat is made to last for many hours. They have not a particle of food with them, but they just lie and suck the bottoms of their paws all the time. I have killed many of them in their trees, which enables me to speak positively upon the subject. However, my neighbor, whose name is McDaniel, and my little son and me went on down to the lake to my second camp, where we had killed the 17 bears the week before, and turned out to hunting. We hunted all day without the dogs getting a single start. We had carried but little provisions with us, and the next morning were entirely out of meat. I sent my son to the house of an old friend, about 3 miles off, to get some. The old gentleman was much pleased to hear that I was hunting in those parts, for the year before the bears had killed a great many of his hogs. He had that day been killing his bacon hogs, and so he gave my son some meat, and sent word to me that I must come into his house that evening, and that he would have plenty of feed for my dogs, and some accommodations for ourselves. But before my son got back, we had gone out hunting, and in a large cane brake my dogs found a big bear in a cane house, which he had fixed for his winter quarters, as they sometimes do. When my lead dog found him and raised the yell, all the rest broke to him, but none of them entered his house till we got up. I encouraged my dogs, and they knowed me so well that I could have made them seize the old serpent himself, with all his horns and heads and cloven feet and ugliness, if he would have only come to light, so they could have seen him. They bulged in, and in an instant the bear followed them out, and I told McDaniel to shoot him, as he was mighty wrathy to kill a bear. He did so, and killed him prime. We carried him to our camp, by which time my son had returned, and after we had got our dinners, we packed up and cut for the house of my friend, whose name was Davidson. We got there and stayed with him that night, and the next morning, having salted up our meat, we left it with him and started to take a hunt between the Obion Lake and the Reelfoot Lake. As there had been a dreadful hurricane which passed between them, I was sure there must be a heap of bears in the fallen timber. We had gone about 5 miles without seeing any sign at all, but at length we got on some high caney ridges, and as we rode along I saw a hole in a large black oak, and on examining more closely I discovered that bear had clomb the tree. I could see his tracks going up but none coming down, and so I was sure he was in there. A person who is acquainted with bear hunting can tell easy enough when the varmint is in the hollow, for as they go up they don't slip a bit, but as they come down they make long scratches with their nails. My friend was a little ahead of me, but I called him back and told him there was a bear in that tree, and I must have him out. So we lit from our horses, and I found a small tree which I thought I could fall so as to make the lodge against my bear tree, and we fell to work chopping it with our tomahawks. I intended, when we lodged the tree against the other, to let my little son go up and look into the hole, for he could climb like a squirrel. We had chopped on a little time and stopped to rest when I heard my dogs barking mightily severe at some distance from us, and I told my friend I knowed they'd had a bear, for it is the nature of dogs, when they find you are hunting bears, to hunt for nothing else. They became fond of the meat and considered other game as not worth a notice, as old John said of the devil. We concluded to leave our tree a bit and went to my dogs, and when we got there, sure enough, They had an eternal, great big, fat bear up a tree, just ready for shooting. My friend again petitioned me for liberty to shoot this one also. I had a little rather not, as the bear was so big, but I couldn't refuse, and so he blazed away, and down came the old fellow like some great log had fell. I now missed one of my dogs, the same I had before spoke of as having treed the bear by himself some time before, when I had started the 3 in the cane brake. I told my friend that my missing dog had a bear somewhere, just as sure as fate. So I left them to butcher the one we had just killed, and I went up on a piece of high ground to listen for my dog. I heard him barking with all his might some distance off, and I pushed ahead for him. My other dogs that were with me heard him and broke for him, and when I got there, sure enough he had another bear already treed. If he hadn't, I wish I may be shot. I fired on him and brought him down, and then went back and helped finish butchering the one when I had left my friend. We then packed on our horses both to the tree where I had left my boy. By this time the little fellow had cut the tree down that we intended to lodge against the hollow one, but it fell the wrong way. He had then feathered in on the big tree to cut that, and had found that it was nothing but a shell on the outside, and all decayed in the middle, as too many of our big men are in these days, having only an outside appearance. My friend and my son cut away on it, and I went off about 100 yards with my dogs to keep them from running under the tree when it should fall. On looking back at the hole in the tree, I saw the bear's head out of it, watching down as they were cutting. I hollered to them to look up, and they did so, and McDaniel catched up his gun, but by the time the bear was out and coming down the tree, he fired at it, and as soon as it touched the ground, the dogs were all round it, and they had a roll and tumble fight to the foot of the hill, where they stopped him. I ran up, and putting my gun against the bear, fired and killed it. We had now 3, and so we made our scaffold and salted them up. End of chapter 12.
Lost in the Woods. Continuation of the Reelfoot hunt. Starts a big fellow in the hurricane, snaking it through the brambles and fallen trees. Trees the bear and kills him and misses his hunting knife. His knife found by McDaniel. A terrible encounter with a bear after dark. Davy kills him with his knife in a deep chasm caused by the earthquakes. The dogs are badly mauled, and Davy is lost in the woods. He climbs up and down a smooth-barked tree all night to keep from freezing to death. Another quake follows. A total of 58 bears in 4 months. The hurricanes so often referred to by Davy were undoubtedly the work of the earthquakes before described, together with fierce windstorms that seemed to be a part of the disturbances. The story of the Reelfoot hunting trip goes on as follows. In the morning, we left my son at the camp, and we started on towards the hurricane. And when we had went about a mile, we started a very large bear, but we got along mighty slow on account of the cracks in the earth occasioned by the earthquakes. These cracks, which may still be traced after the lapse of 100 years, ran from the southwest to the northeast, and in many places great trees that had been split in the middle stood with divided trunks above the chasms. We, however, managed to keep within hearing of the dogs for about 3 miles, and then we come to the hurricane. Here we had to quit our horses, as old Nick himself couldn't have got through it without sneaking along in the form he put on to make a fool of our old grandmother Eve. By this time, several of my dogs had got tired and come back, but we went out ahead for some time in the hurricane, when we met a bear coming straight to us, and not more than 20 or 30 yards off. I started my tired dogs after him, and McDaniel pursued them, and I went back on to where my other dogs were. I had seen the track of the bear they were after, and I knew he was a screamer. I followed on to about the middle of the hurricane, but my dogs pursued him so close that they had him climb an old stump about 20 feet high. I got within shooting distance of him, and I fired, but I was all over in such a flutter from fatigue and running that I couldn't hold steady. But, however, I broke his shoulder, and he fell. I run up and loaded my gun as quick as possible, and shot him again and killed him. When I went to take out my knife to butcher him, I found I had lost it in coming through the hurricane. The vines and briars were so thick that I would sometimes have to get down and crawl like a varmint to get through it all, and a vine had, as I supposed, caught in the handle and pulled it out. While I was standing and studying what to do, my friend came to me. He had followed my trail through the hurricane and had found my knife, which was mighty good news to me, as a hunter hates the worst in the world to lose a good dog or any part of his hunting tools. I now left McDaniel to butcher the bear, and went after the horses, and brought them as near as the nature of the case would allow. I then took our bags and went back to where he was, and when he had skinned the bear, we fleeced off the fat and carried it to our horses in several loads. We then packed it upon our horses, and had a heavy load on each one. We now started, and went on till about sunset, when I concluded we must be near our camp. So I hollered, and my son answered me, and we moved on in the direction to the camp. We had gone but a little way when I heard my dogs make a warm start again, and I jumped down from my horse and gave him up to my friend and told him I would follow them. He went on to the camp, and I went ahead after my dogs with all my might for a considerable distance, till at last night came on. The ground was very rough and hilly, and all covered over with cane. I now was compelled to move on more slowly, and was frequently falling over logs and into the cracks of the earthquakes, so that I was very much afraid I would break my gun. However, I went about 3 miles when I came to a good big creek, which I waded. It was very cold, and the creek was about knee-deep, but I felt no great inconvenience from it just then, as I was all over wet with sweat from running, and I felt hot enough. After I got over this creek and out of the cane, which was very thick on all our creeks, I listened for my dogs. I found they had either treed or brought the bear to a stop, as they continued barking in the same place. I pushed on in the direction of the noise as far as I could, till I found the hill was too steep for me to climb, and so I looked back and went down the creek for some distance, till I came to a hollow, and took up that till I came to the place where I could climb the hill. It was mighty dark, and it was difficult to see my way or anything else. When I got up the hill, I found I had passed the dogs, and so I turned and went to them. I found, when I got there, they had treed the bear in a large forked poplar, and it was setting in the fork. I could see the lump, but not plain enough to shoot with any certainty, as there was no moonlight, and so I set in to hunting for some dry brush to make me a light, but I could find none, though I could find that the ground was worn mightily to pieces by the cracks. At last I thought I could shoot by guess and kill him, so I pointed as near the lump as I could and fired away, but the bear didn't come. He only climbed up higher and got out on a limb, which helped me to see him better. I now loaded up and fired again, but he didn't move at all this time. I commenced loading for a third fire, but the first thing I'd knowed, the bear was down among my dogs, and they were fighting all around me. I had my big butcher knife in my belt, and I had a pair of dressed buckskin breeches on, so I took out my knife and stood, determined that if he should get a hold of me, to defend myself in the best way I could. I stood there for some time, and could now and then see a white dog I had, but the rest of them, and the bear, I couldn't see at all. It was so miserable dark. They still fought around me, and within 3 feet of me, but at last the bear got down into one of the cracks that the earthquake had made in the ground, about 4 feet, and I could tell the biting end of him by the hollering of my dogs. So I took my gun and pushed the muzzle of it about till I thought I had it against the main part of his body, and fired. But it happened to be only the fleshy part of his foreleg, and with this he jumped out of the crack, and he and the dogs had another hard fight around me as before. At last, however, they forced him back into the crack again, as he was when I had shot. I then began to hunt for my gun, which I had laid down in the dark, and, while hunting, I got a hold of a pole, and I concluded I would punch him with it a while. I did so, and when I would punch him, the dogs would jump in on him, and when he would bite them badly, and they would jump out again. I concluded, as he would take the punching so patiently, it might be that he would lie still enough for me to get down into the crack, and feel slowly along till I could find the right place to give him a dig with my butcher. So I got down, and my dogs got in front of him, and kept his head towards them till I got along easily up to him, and placed my hand on his rump, felt for his shoulder, just behind where I had intended to stick him. I made a lunge with my long knife, and fortunately struck him right through the heart, at which he just sank down, and I crawled out in a hurry. Davy had to stay all night at the place where he had killed the bear, and nearly froze to death before morning. To avoid this, he hit upon a plan that would be impossible for most men to carry out. He found a 2-foot tree nearby, without limbs, for 30 feet, and began climbing it as far as the forks, and then sliding back to the ground. He managed to keep his blood in circulation. When McDaniel afterwards saw what Davy had done, he said he wouldn't have gone down in the place with the bear for all of the bears in the woods. The two men worked and hunted all the next day, and at night were glad to rest. They had gone to sleep as near the fire as they dared when something happened, as Davy says. About 10 o'clock there came a most terrible earthquake, which shook the earth so that we were rocked about like we had been in a cradle. We were very much alarmed, for though we were accustomed to feel earthquakes, we were now right in the region which had been torn to pieces by them in 1812, and we thought it might take a notion to swallow us up, as the big fish did to Jonah. When the hunt ended, and the meat had been packed to their homes, both McDaniel and Davy had enough to spare. Davy says that during the fall and up to January he killed 58 bears, thus adding to his already great renown as a bear hunter. End of chapter 13.
The Mississippi Flood. The flatboats start for New Orleans. All hands appalled by the Mississippi's flood. A good-for-nothing pilot. They try in vain to make a landing. Passing the Devil's Elbow. Uncle Julius is mighty scared. The darky's song. A sudden wreck and a close call for Davy. The crew sit all night on the flood trash of an island in the middle of the river. They are rescued by a steamboat and landed at Memphis. Davy finds a friend in Major Winchester. His return home. The bears have taken to their winter hiding places, at least those that Davy and his partners had not killed. There was nothing to keep back the work of splitting staves and completing the two boats. The latter were of the flat-bottom sort, strongly built of hewed timbers and planks, sawed in pits or upon scaffolds. They were caulked and pitched, and each had a well for the purpose of bailing water that leaked in. The decks were flat, with a small hatchway house over the entrance of the cabin below it. On board of a ship, this would be called the companionway. The steering was done with a long sweep or oar at the stern, and sometimes with poles. 30,000 staves were put on board the two boats, and as soon as everything was ready, a start was made. The Deer and the Obion rivers flow into the Mississippi at no great distance apart. Near the mouth of the Obion, a lake or bayou joins the channels, and this lake is thought by many to be the one upon whose shores the boats were built. As Davy was but a short time in getting his fleet out of the Obion and into the Mississippi, the lake must have been near the latter river. When they floated out into the Father of Waters, as the Indians called the great river, the venturous woodsmen were appalled by the immensity of the flood upon which they were borne swiftly along. Across the mile or more of yellow water that reached from shore to shore, bordered with leafless sycamores and cypress swamps, they saw new perils loom at every curve of the tortuous stream. The river flows at the rate of 200 feet per minute, and as island after island and bend after bend had to be avoided or navigated with all the strength and watchfulness that was in them, it is not to be wondered at that, as Davy says, all the hands were bad scared. Davy's motto had always been to go ahead, but now he seems to have had no choice. He had never been down the river, probably never before had seen it, and the man hired as pilot was found to be a fraud. As the two boats were constantly either drifting apart or bumping into each other, they were lashed together, in the hope that in that way they might be more manageable. Towards night, they fell in with some boats from the Ohio, and when Davy wanted to make a landing and tried without success to stop at the river's banks, the Ohio boatman shouted to him to keep on and run all night. He didn't want then to go ahead, but there was no other way. The clumsy craft were always trying to butt into trouble. Sawyers and planters and sandbars and right about curves of the channel were forcing the crew to superhuman exertions, partly because they trusted to main strength without skill. Soon after they gave up trying to land, they came to a place called the Devil's Elbow. Here, Davy says, he had the hardest work of his life. He twice attempted to land at wood yards, but could not. The people on shore tried to guide them with lights and shouted to direct their efforts, but the boats were too heavy to manage. And finally, the exhausted crew gave up the fight and let the river sweep them along at will. Davy was sitting by the stove in the cabin of one of the boats, thinking of what a hobble he had got himself into, and how much better bear hunting was than being on the water, where he had to go ahead whether he wanted to or not, when he heard someone walking slowly back and forth on the deck above him, and he went up the companionway to see who it was. The boats were sweeping along through the dark, and in spite of attempts to steer, the crew were really trusting to a merciful providence. The uneasy mortal for whom Davy was looking proved to be Uncle Julius, the darky cook. "What's the matter, Uncle?" Davy said. "Can't you sleep?" "'Deed I can't, Mars Davy," was the doleful reply. "The squinch owls and the hoot owls making a heap of noise on the show, and the wolves is a-howling like the ants been after 'em. 'Pears like I's so uneasy I can't sleep for thinking of the time when the crawfishes bowed the holes in the ground, and all the animals and all the folkses, 'cep'n Nora and his critters, went down to the bottom, kerblunkety blink. I ain't much for whimpering around, but I's mighty juberous about this here kin of sailing. And when you says I can't sleep, Mars Dave, you shows knocking at the back door." Davy said a word to cheer up the old darky, then looked about him before going down below. The ripple of the water against the sides of the boats was like the wash of waves on an unknown coast. From the tall buttonwood and cottonwood trees upon the shore came the hoo, hoo, to hoo, 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 to hoo, that stirred the superstition of the darky's nature. The tremulous cry of the coon, the howling of a wolf, and the bay of a hound floated out across the muddy stream. Then there came a sudden splashing of the water ahead, and a flock of ducks flew away with loud and angry clamor. From overhead, the wild geese call was like the faraway blast of a trumpet blown by spirits of the air. The wind was chill, and there was nothing a bear hunter could do. So Davy went below again, but not to sleep. The darky was trying to keep up his spirits by singing, the words of his ditty being somewhat similar to those made famous by Uncle Remus. "Oh, the first news you know, the day'll be a-breaking, and the fire be a-burning, and the ash cake a-baking, and the hen'll be a-hollering, and the boss'll be awaking. Better get up, nigger, and give yourself a shaking. Hi-ho, Miss Cindy Ann. Oh, honey, when you hear that tin horn a-tootin', oh, honey, when you hear that squinch owl a-hootin', oh, honey, when you hear them little pigs a-rootin', right then she's a-comin', a-skippin', and a-scootin'. Hi-ho, Miss Cindy Ann." Davy most profoundly wished for the daylight the old cook was praying for. Suddenly there was a crash, and the covering of the way to the deck was crushed flat, perhaps from being struck by the limbs of a tree. There was no chance to get out of the place where he was sitting. The scurrying of feet sounded above. There was a sudden thump and a tipping of the boat as the clumsy craft struck the head of an island and lodged against a pile of flood trash and loose timbers. Realizing his danger, Davy tried in vain to force his way up the stairs. As the boat careened, the opening used for dipping water from the river was exposed, the other boat having drifted away. He tried to get out through this, but found it too small. In desperation, he put his arms through as far as he could, and as the water was not yet up to his face, he says he hollered as loud as he could roar, telling the crew to pull him out or pull him in two. It was a case of life or death. With no time to wait, by a violent pull they dragged him through. He had been without a coat in the cabin and now found himself without his shirt and so badly scratched up that he was skinned like a rabbit. He says he was glad enough to escape alive without shirt or hide. The whole crew then left the boats to their fate and climbed onto the timber, which seems to have been in the form of a raft, where they sat without much on till morning. Davy had at this time a hope of success in the next election, and as he sat, disconsolate and barefooted in the middle of the Mississippi, 2 miles wide, he says, "I reckon I looked like a pretty cracklin' ever to get to Congress." In the midst of so many troubles, Davy showed his grit, and his reflections at the time are worth recording. We had now lost all our loading and every particle of our clothing except what we had on. But over all this, while I was sitting there, in the night, floating about on a drift, I felt happier and better off than I had ever felt before in my life, for I had just made such a marvelous escape that I had forgot almost everything but that, and so I felt prime. About daylight, a steamboat was seen coming down the river, and they flew such signals of distress as the state of their wardrobes allowed. It is traditional that one of the men stripped off his red shirt and waved it on the end of a cane pole that had caught in the flood trash. A cheery blast from the boat's whistle answered the signals, and as she stopped above them, a skiff was seen leaving her side. In a short time, all were taken aboard the rescuing craft, whose name is not known. She landed them at Memphis without shoes or hats or any other articles of wearing apparel in sufficiency for half the crew. As they were passing one of the gambling rooms with which Memphis abounded in those days, someone hailed Davy, calling him Colonel Crockett. It proved to be one of the men who had been at the Talladega fight. Davy's old comrade induced him to go with him to the store of Major Winchester, a wealthy trader. Davy was as proud a mortal as ever drew breath, but with a heart full of gratitude, he accepted the Major's offer of money and clothing for himself and the destitute crew. For this, the Major would take nothing as security, not even a note or receipt, and his kindness and his faith in the Colonel never were forgotten. From Memphis, Davy went down the river to Natchez by steamboat, hoping to recover the boats in case they had held together. He heard of one of them 50 miles below Memphis, where attempts had been made to stop it, but he says she was as hard-headed as ever. Nothing was afterwards known of the other. So ended another of Davy's ventures, and again he went home with empty hands to the little cabin at the end of the trail through the Obion wilderness. In this lone clearing, he was literally the man from the cane, but he had no idea of staying there. He hunted bears and planted his crops and waited his time. When this had come, he again offered for Congress and started upon an electioneering tour. His trip, in which the boats were lost, was in the year 1826, probably late in the fall. The congressional campaign occurred in 1827, and the election was in August of that year. Some of the incidents of the canvass by Davy will be told in the next chapter. End of chapter 14.
Chapter 15, Clay and Webster. Davy runs for Congress. He plays the part of the little red fox. The guinea hens annoy Davy's opponent. Davy's coonskin cap and his rifle win the election in spite of Jackson's opposition. He is now the Honorable David Crockett, M.C., and a national character. Again crosses the mountains on his way to the capital. Familiar scenes bring back old memories. He repays the friend who lent him money for the campaign. In the straggling village of Washington, Davy's dream of future greatness, he becomes acquainted with Clay, Webster, and other great men. It will be remembered that Davy was beaten by 2 votes in 1825, Colonel Alexander being elected to Congress at a time when cotton was 25 cents per pound. The colonel took his part of the credit for this advance in prices, and was a winner as a tariff supporter. While he was in Congress, cotton tumbled to 6 and 8 cents, and the colonel was out of political ammunition. The story of Colonel Crockett's bear hunting on the Obion had been told in every cabin. His wreck and escape from drowning on the river awakened the sympathy of every poor man in his district, and they made up the greater part of the population. As may be supposed, Davy had no money for a canvass of so large a district, but a good friend gave him enough to start with, and seems to have been at many of the meetings, always with a little more to help along. In time this amounted to $150, not a great sum for a 3 months' campaign. Davy's opponents were Colonel Alexander for re-election and General William Arnold of the militia, who was also an advocate and a brilliant speaker. The situation reminds us of the Aesopian fable. A lion and a tiger happened to come together over the dead body of a fawn that had recently been shot. A fierce battle ensued, and as each animal was in the prime of his age and strength, the combat was long and furious. At last they lay stretched on the ground, panting, bleeding, and exhausted, each unable to lift a paw against the other. An impudent fox, coming by at the time, stepped in and carried off before their eyes the prey for which they had suffered so much. It is a curious coincidence when Davy says that he was as cunning as a little red fox, and would not risk his tail in a committal trap, carefully avoiding any declaration of his rather vague political creed. His competitors were so busy warring against each other that they lost sight of the little red fox, whom they had not thought worthy of attention. In one of the eastern counties of the district an amusing incident occurred. The 3 candidates were to speak at a meeting, and Davy's turn came first. He made a short talk in the style that he had found always interested the men of his kind. The others followed with tedious attacks upon each other's platforms, but without honoring Davy with a mention. In the midst of Colonel Alexander's speech some guinea hens raised their sharp staccato cries that sounded like "Crockett, Crockett, Crockett." They so disturbed the colonel that he had them driven away before going on with the speech. As soon as he had finished, Davy congratulated him upon being opposed to foul language in public. The colonel was at a loss for a reply to something of which he did not see the point, whereupon Davy went on to explain that the guinea hens had offended his opponent because they had called for "Crockett, Crockett." The whole crowd caught the joke and yelled with fierce backwoods mirth, and Davy records that "the colonel seemed mighty bad plagued." Party lines were not tightly drawn in those days, but out of the confusion was slowly taking place a separation of the elements that were to form the Republicans under Jackson and the Whigs who later elected General Harrison as President of the United States. The Republicans later became the Democratic Party, and about 1856, strange and confusing as it now seems, their opponents took the name of Republicans. Davy went into every nook and corner of his district, meeting and making friends. If there was a barbecue, he was the first attraction. At a shooting match, every one gloried in his skill. When the returns were complete, they showed that Colonel Crockett had a plurality of 2,748 votes. This was so remarkable a victory over the men who supported the tariff legislation of 1824 that Davy became known at once all over the United States. The men who were urging the people of the country to make Jackson president, and who elected him in 1828, were proud of his origin. They gloried in his lowly birth, and proclaimed him a proof of the virtues that existed beneath the rough garb of the backwoodsman. And as they glorified Andrew Jackson, they exalted Davy Crockett. What Jackson had been, Davy Crockett was. He was still the man from the cane, the bear hunter, the Indian fighter, the man who went ahead. In his little cabin on the Obion were his wife and children, sons and daughters of the wilderness. His coonskin cap still hung upon the wall, his rifle stood by the open door, his garments were spun beneath his humble roof, and with his own daily labor he fed those who were dear to him. He was honest, fearless, and could read and write only with difficulty. All these things endeared him to the men of the Chickasaw Purchase, who also could read and write only with infinite pains. Until now, the presidents of the United States had been chosen from the ranks of the aristocrats. John Quincy Adams, who was then president, was the oldest and most dignified of the long line. Congress convened in December in regular session, and after a tearful farewell to his family, the Hon. David Crockett, M.C., from Tennessee, took the old trail across the mountains. Many of his boyhood friends came to meet him after he left Nashville, and every day brought back old memories as he saw the familiar scenes. The sumacs glowed like fire upon the slopes of the Great Smoky Mountains, and among the somber forests of pine and hemlock were the gold and crimson glories of the maple and the oak. The deer still watched the travelers from its hiding place, and the owl called solemnly through the twilight, as of old. But the tom-tom no longer summoned the red men to council, or stirred the quiet wilderness with a dread of the tomahawk and the knife. The work of the pioneer was done. The farmer and the artisan were building an empire upon the foundations he had laid, and Davy Crockett, backwoodsman and scout, was about to take part with the proudest in the land in the making of a nation's laws. Before he started for Washington, his rich friend advanced him $100 more to cover his expenses to that city. Regarding this loan, he has said, "I came on to Washington and drawed $250 and purchased with it a check on the bank at Nashville and enclosed it to my friend, and I may say in truth I sent this money with a right good will, for I reckon nobody in this world loves a friend better than me, or remembers a kindness longer." As the early nights came on in Washington, which was then an unkempt city of scarcely 20,000 people, which 12 years afterwards the English traveler George Combes wrote of as a straggling village in a half-drained swamp, Davy looked across the marshes of the Potomac and the Anacostia, and pictured to himself a far-away scene upon the Rutherford Fork, a little space in the wilderness, where the cornstalks rustled in the autumn wind, the sturdy cabin, built of logs and chinked with clay, before whose door his faithful hounds slept a fitful sleep, awaiting their master's call, the nearby Hurricane, where the bears ever grew fatter, undisturbed by the crack of rifle or the baying of dogs, bright loving faces looking wistfully across the unnumbered miles on which he had followed the flickering torch of fame. He believed himself a great man. Against the polished learning and the subtleties of the aristocrat, he measured with a rather excusable complacency his own common sense and his own victories. As the days wore on, he became used to the daily grind at the Capitol. He found himself known to every public man in the city, and became more reconciled to political life. His idioms of speech were watched for with an intentness that flattered his pride. He no longer wore a coonskin cap or homespun clothing, but there was something in the way in which he traversed the quagmires of Pennsylvania Avenue that was different from the more mincing gait of the aristocratic statesmen and diplomats who found relief from their official labors in leading the minuet. Davy entered into politics in dead earnest, and by the time he had been sought out by such men as Henry Clay and Daniel Webster, and others eager to turn to account every factor in politics, he began to dream. Andrew Jackson had come of lowly parentage, from a cabin in the wilderness. He was sure to be elected president if he lived in 2 years more. If Andrew Jackson, why not Davy Crockett? Davy's ambitious nature is revealed in his own story, written or dictated during his career as a congressman, and after his departure from the Republican or Jackson fold. In this he makes these remarks, as he tells one of the reasons for recounting his experiences in book form. I know that as obscure as I am, my name is making considerable of a fuss in the world. I can't tell why it is, nor in what it is to end. Go where I will, everybody seems anxious to get a peep at me, and it would be hard to tell which would have the advantage if I and the government, Jackson, and Black Hawk, Adam Huntsman, his competitor in the congressional campaigns, and a great big eternal caravan of wild varmints were all to be showed at the same time in 4 different parts of any of the big cities in the nation. I am not so sure that I should not get the most custom of any of the crew. There must therefore be something in me or about me that attracts attention, which is even mysterious to myself. In one instance, Davy uses the words, just as Clay and Webster and myself are preparing to fix bank matters on account of the scarcity of money. He also speaks of a few such men as Clay and Webster and myself. His reflections at this time throw light upon the sudden turning point in his career a few years later. When Davy arrived at Washington, the news of the great naval battle of Navarino had just arrived by the clipper ship North Star, 12 days from London. When she rounded to in Baltimore harbor, stowing her sails with trim precision almost before her anchor caught, the men of the sea were more interested in the crackerjack run than in the news she brought. When Davy heard of the incidents connected with the naval battle, he is said to have remarked that when 3 kinds of wild varmints get to hunting together, Uncle Sam would better be looking out for his sheep. He referred to the fact that during 4 hours of the afternoon of October 20th, 1827, the combined squadrons of England, Russia, and France, made up of 10 ships of the line, 10 frigates, and 9 smaller vessels, had shot to pieces or sunk under fire more than 100 war vessels of the Turkish navy under Moharem Bey, 4,000 Moslems being killed or drowned. The Battle of Navarino failed to wake Uncle Sam to his need of a navy, and until the wolves, in the shape of the Florida and the Alabama and other ships quite as daring, began to thin his flock, he remained asleep. The politicians of 1827 to 1840 were men who fought each other with any weapons they could wield, and in want of weapon they used filth and mud. A merciful oblivion has covered with the dust of many years their words and deeds. End of chapter 15. Recording by Bill Mosley, Llano County, Texas, USA, June 3rd, 2023. Chapter 16. In Congress. Davy's place in politics. He is elected for a 2nd term. His opposition to President Jackson. After 2 terms in Congress, he is defeated by a contemptible trick. The influence of the Morrell gang is felt. 2 years in retirement. Writing his autobiography. The Middle Fork camp meeting. The wildcat hunter from the Wolf Creek branch. At a shooting match. The generosity of Davy. He is elected by a large majority. During his first term in Congress in 1828 and 1829, Davy seems to have been lined up with the Jackson faction, which was opposed to the Adams administration, then allied with the friends of Henry Clay. In 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected president by a remarkable percentage of the Electoral College, and Davy Crockett, one of his former scouts, watched him as he rode to the Capitol, dismounted, and with lifted hand swore loyalty to the nation that had chosen him for the highest place in its power to give. How many have pictured the rude simplicity of such a proceeding? The rugged soldier, the sorry steed, their democratic souls have been much deceived. Jackson's horse was the finest that could be found in Kentucky or Tennessee. He wore no uniform, but in his broadcloth coat and ruffles he sat his saddle like a king, more stately, more exemplary of power than many of his successors who have been seated upon the velvet cushions of landaus. There was a rattling of dry bones in the departments as Old Hickory swept from power and position hundreds of the appointees of his predecessors. The now familiar cry, "To the victors belong the spoils," became the slogan of his followers. Davy seems to have had no place in the crowd that fawned about their master's feet. He may have seen the ill-mannered mob that thrust aside the doorkeepers of the White House at the public receptions, invaded the parlors and dining rooms, climbed upon the satin upholsteries, and fell upon the refreshments like the locusts of Egypt, filling the houses and eating the residue of that which escaped. But of his 2 years' term he has written hardly 100 words. He went back to his cabin home, conducted another campaign, and was again elected by an overwhelming majority of nearly 3,600 votes. During Davy's second term in 1830 and 1831, Jackson urged the removal of the Cherokees and other Indian tribes from the lands east of the Mississippi. Davy did not see the relentless power of advancing civilization behind the unquiet of the frontier, and the impossibility of resisting the impulse towards the separation of the whites and the aborigines, and voted against the removal, in spite of strenuous urging by those who favored it. It was of this vote that he has said, "I would rather be honestly and politically damned than to be hypocritically immortalized." Returning again to his district in 1831, he found, as he says, the storm raised against him. He was accused of the unpardonable sin of turning against Jackson. "I was hunted down like a wild varmint," he has told us, "and in this hunt every little paper in the district and every little pinhook lawyer was engaged." He was accused of receiving pay for sessions from which he was absent, and his wrath was kindled by these charges of dishonesty in doing what every other congressman had done. His district was gerrymandered, and all the political weapons of his opponents were set to work. In the language of the cowboy of a later generation, "they wore their guns and they wore 'em mighty low." Davy was beaten by a smart and entirely unscrupulous scheme. He says that "the little fourpence halfpenny limbs of the law" gave notice over all the district of dates upon which Crockett would appear to explain his actions in Congress and his reasons for his opposition to Jackson. When crowd after crowd gathered at the time and place announced the absence of Crockett, entirely unaware of the trick that was being played, was laid to his fear of facing the issues raised. He was afraid, the fourpence halfpenny lawyers cried, and the disappointed voters went to their homes stirred with doubt and resentment. When the votes were counted in August, Davy was in the majority in 17 counties, but in Madison County, the home of the Murrell outlaws and their allies, his opponent had enough to overcome all that Davy had in the rest of the district. In Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi, he has told the story of the methods of the Murrell gang, a story too sickening for repetition. The existence of such a fraternity of criminals had a great influence upon the history of Texas and its neighbors, the United States and Mexico. Under the great cottonwoods in the swamps of Madison County, men met who had plundered and burned ships and cut throats all the way from Curacao to the Bahama Banks and Barnegat. who had both filled and emptied the unspeakable barracoons of the slave trade on the Guinea coast, who had been midnight assassins in Paris and Madrid, brigands from the ruins of the Appian Way, pirates from every maritime nation of the globe, and always besides there was the more or less gentlemanly gambler of the Mississippi river boats, ready to lead or follow where there was promise of plunder. There were secret signs, passwords, and grips, relay stations on their highways of crime, and everywhere Confederates who ranked with the first citizens in unsullied reputations and sober living. The gang sold slaves trained to run away, to be sold again and then again, until led into the tangled pathways of some reeking swamp, to die the death of a dog at the hands of men who left no danger of detection overlooked. In 1835 their operations as gamblers upon the great river, and as robbers and swindlers along its shores, led to their being driven out of the jurisdiction of the courts and vigilance committees of the frontier. They went to Texas, because there was no other place to which they dared to go. Here their reckless habits infused new life into the discontent already existing among the colonists, and hastened the inevitable conflict that was soon to occur. During the years 1832 and 1833, Davy was a private citizen, but he was by no means an idle one. If he still hunted the bears of the Hurricane at his back door, he tells nothing in regard to such pursuits. His time was taken up in writing the story of his own life, and in planning for the next election. That he wrote his autobiography in the 2 years mentioned is shown by the work itself. His constant references to the removal of the deposits from the United States Bank is good proof that much of the book was written after the date of the removal. In his canvass of his district for votes, while fighting his way back to Washington, Davy found his lessons in history and national questions of great assistance. His easy familiarity with the names of famous statesmen, his crude painting of Eastern life and manners, and his new self-possession in speaking before a crowd, all served to awaken the admiration and win the support of a people who loved the spectacular in politics. His readiness to pit himself against all comers, in everything from oration to sharpshooting, made him an attraction at every public gathering. The story of the Middle Fork camp meeting has not yet faded from the memory of the men who lived upon its banks. It was a splendid summer afternoon when Davy rode into an open place in the forest, 20 miles east of his cabin, where 200 or 300 men and women had come to listen to the exhortations of the writer, a long, ungainly preacher. He was about to lead in a hymn when a rough and red-nosed man with a bottle of whiskey in his pocket leaped upon the rock and leveled his rifle at the faces of the astonished people. "The first man sings has got to fight," he yelled. "I'm the wildcat hunter from the Wolf Creek branch of the Rutherford Creek. I've et up all the Injuns, bears, and wildcats as fur as the Big Sandy, and I'm dying hungry now for hymn books and preachers and folks that sings." He stopped, glared at the astonished old rider, then took out the bottle and drank a half-dozen swallows with a gurgling sound. Someone spoke in the crowd. "Shut up!" he yelled, lifting his bottle and waving it above the shrinking women and children below. "Shut up and get out of sight before you see the wildcat hunter eat the preacher, hide and hair." There was the crack of a rifle, and the bottle was shattered into fragments, dashing the raw liquor into the rowdy's eyes and cutting his face with bits of glass. When he could see, Davy Crockett's gun was almost touching his nose. "Hand the preacher your gun," said Davy. "Stand where you are and sing like all possessed. If you don't, we'll make you eat a wildcat for sure. All right, preacher, go ahead." After the singing was over, the wildcat hunter hung about, trying in vain to recover his gun, and finally departed in discreet silence, as the daylight faded in the west. Many of Davy's admirers became acquainted with him at the barbecues and shooting matches that were frequent during his campaigns. With so little diversion in their narrow lives, the frontiersmen flocked to such meetings from far and near, bringing their wives and children, and driving before them the cattle to be put up as prizes for the marksmen. Davy was always ready for such a competition, and was never obliged to content himself with the hide and tallow. The usual method in such matches was to sell several chances on each animal. The best marksmen took their choice of the several parts of the beef, the order of their choosing to be fixed by the result of the match. The one making the lowest score took the hide and tallow as a consolation. The score of such a match was kept about as follows. Each man handed the judges a burnt board, rubbed down nearly to the sound part of the wood. On this circles of 1/2 inch, 1 inch, and 1½ inches were made with a pair of dividers or the ruder compasses of the carpenter. Each man shot the agreed number of times at his own board at from 50 to 60 yards distance, toeing the mark made by the judges. Upon many an occasion Davy divided up his winnings with the men who had been unsuccessful. Davy won this election after much hard work on the stump. End of section 16. Recording by Bill Mosley, August 24th, 2023.